Yeah, so like, do you want to like just give a very brief description of the last two chapters or where we left off?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the last two chapters, let's see. We were talking about, well, I mean, it's talking about the critical problem and, um, that idealists start with thoughts and realists start with being. That Thomists do not assume that being exists, but it's a self-evident proposition because the existence of being is like the very basis of our knowledge. It's the first thing that we know according to Aristotle and St. Thomas, and it's to be self-evident because if it were, if demonstrated by anything prior to it, then it wouldn't be the first principle. Um, and yeah, it talks about how idealism is uh, it makes the mistake of separating the mind from the body and the senses. Um, and I mean, basically, I think the summary is idealism starts out with thoughts, realists start out with being, and that's the key takeaway. I think that I would take from both of those chapters, really. Um,
Yeah,
and the next section, I think it kind of well, there's still some threads about idealism, but we'll get into that. Do you have anything you want to say about the previous two chapters before we do that?
no, those are the main points that we covered, and are in relation to the next, or at least this one of chapter five, in which we're dealing with first principles of being and knowledge. Yeah. So I guess that's just we can just move right into the chapter five now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So pretty much he just starts off with what was already said in the previous chapter, that the principles uh, in idealism is that like the mind is first, and when it comes to realism, the first principles is the things. And before even getting into like some of the details of those of what that implies, he goes into explaining what is like principle. What do we mean by first principles? Because at least during his time, it was understood that like first principles was like how do we order things, like laws, in regards to the mind and all, if I recall.
Yeah, no, that's an important part, I think, um, because yeah, they're going to be thinking about the laws of logic and stuff like that as being uh, uh, principles of thought rather than principles of being. And yeah, he does. He shows that the principles are actually derivable from being in this section. So, for example, he says that um, basically the principle of being is that being is being, and being is not non-being, and you can derive the law of non-contradiction from that basic idea of what being is. Um, he actually, I wonder if he's taking this from Garrigou Lagrange, because Garrigou Lagrange talks like does this kind of same thing inside of his book Reality. Um, but in any case, yeah, he goes through that and shows that actually it's not just like a law of thought as is implied by the laws of logic. It's more of a principle of being, and it comes from our understanding of what being is. That being is being. This is actually why I prefer not to use the term laws of logic. I prefer to say principles of being when talking about like the principle of contradiction and such.
Yeah, and he also goes into like what is common in regards to all kinds of judgments, that when you sort of when you take away the subject and the predicate and all that, it's very clear that like every sort of form of judgment, um, they can refer to many different things. He gives the example of like man is rational, softness is a quality, triangle is a three-sided two-dimensional magnitude, justice is a virtue. Napoleon the First was an emperor of the French. He gives different kinds of judgments. They all really they're not there's they're all different things. They all are referring to different things. But if you notice, there's something in common with them. They're using existence, and when it comes to making those judgments, and that is referred to in the verb it is. And you can come, and this is the point that he was trying to drive here, is that you can be a metaphysical realist without even knowing it for most of your life, because the way that you're making, you're coming to judgments and all that, you are using the principle of being. Even if you don't come to philosophizing this in the first place and all that, because it really doesn't take philosophy to just come up with this in the first place. You're when you're making a judgment and all that, you're already kind of like using the principle of being in regards to existence and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he goes back to this later in the chapter where he asks the question of whether it's possible. I don't know if we want to jump ahead that far, but he whether it's possible to deny the law of non-contradiction, and he points out that, um, well, no, because in even denying the law of non-contradiction, what you're doing is uh, holding to the principle of being, right? Because you're saying that you are in this state of uh, being uh, whenever you deny the law of non-contradiction. That's like a state of being. And so if you deny that, then you're like contradicting yourself. You're saying, well, I mean, you would be denying the law of non-contradiction and not denying it at the same time. Um, and this comes from Aristotle. Um, and that kind of gets to the next section because Aristotle says, well, no, you can't deny it, but you could just be a mutist, which he talks about a little bit, where you just don't say anything about the law at all. You just say, oh, well, I can't know anything, which of course that has its own problems, but you can't even say that really. You just say nothing at all about what you say. Um, and Aristotle says that, well, then you're no different from a plant, which is kind of funny. Um, but in any case, uh, Wilhelmsen says that the mutist are just like afraid of the absolute. Um, they're afraid of saying that something is true because it might lead to something that they don't like the conclusion that God exists, or that some sexual perversion that they like is wrong, or something along those lines. And he also says something that's interesting, that this is like a sign of a widespread decaying in society whenever this kind of mutism is present in society. And it's kind of, I think it's kind of uh, something that's present in our society today, which is doesn't bode well for what's going on right now. But yeah.
And then he gets into the next denial of the principle of being, which is the denial of Hegel. And this is one that I'm still trying to wrap my head around, because it's well, yeah, it's the way that kind of presents itself is. I guess you have to be very invested in things like German idealism to like sort of see what it is. But anyways, it's that Hegel, for Hegel, like being contradicts itself, like because being and thought are one, and thought is self contradictory. So it's he's going he's just repeating something that like earlier when Wilson points out that he's just repeating also like what earlier philosophers as Plato have pointed out, that like when you come up with something, you come up with when you come up with a judgment, you also come up there's like it's contradictory. Like, you know, some cow or all cows are black is contradicted by like some cow is not black. One academician is a fool is contradicted by some academician is a fool, and so forth like that. And Hegel applied this the to being, that, you know, being, the judgment being is contradicted by being is not being, and because of that, you know, like being contradicts itself. And the reason why Hegel did this is because that was the way that he could account like for change in his system, and uh, and that's kind of, you know, where you get into dialectics in regards to idealism. Yeah.
I'm not really. I haven't ever read Hegel. I started reading one of his books, and then I was just like, no thanks, because basically the reason is because I started out. I read some of Kant, and I realized ultimately that Kant's view of the world, I mean, was idealistic, and it didn't really make any sense to me. And then Hegel's kind of moving on from like uh, starting point, from what I understand, and so I just wasn't interested in it. But I mean, from what Wilhelmsen is saying, basically, it seems like what he's saying is that uh, Hegel identified being with thought, as you said, and within thought, we also have this. We have the contrary in addition to the positive affirmation uh, present. And so I guess he thought that, well, within being, since being and thought are the same, there's going to be the contrary to being present. Uh, but Wilhelmsen points out, well, once you're a realist and you're not an idealist, this kind of like it's just pretty easy to reject this view, because, well, if you think about what's the opposite of I think he said a piece of paper. There's existing piece of paper and then the negation of the existing piece of paper. If you think about like what is the negation of existing piece of paper in reality, well, it's nothing. There's just nothing there, and so it's not the contrary of an existing paper doesn't exist. It's not a thing. Um, and so that was, I don't know if he's representing Hegel correctly or not, but that was his response to Hegel. Um, and if he's representing it correctly, I mean, that seems pretty obviously true to me as well. Um, from there, he does get into logic positivism. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Sure. If I guess one thing before moving into that section, there was something that he mentioned about like that, you know, for being to not, like that being is not there's no contradiction in being and all that when you're trying to like, you know, understand things and all that. Wilson points out that like you don't need like these like armory full of logical dialectical weapons to understand, like, you know, that, you know, when a thing exists and all that, you can just look at something, contemplate on it, and then from there on, you know, just kind of, you know, get it. You know, he gets the example, the piece of paper. Like you're looking at this, you make this judgment about like this, the paper exists, and you know, like now, like there's the contradiction where it's like the paper does not exist, like, you know, equally as valid, but like when you examine it, like you know, when you examine it, either the propositions, the only way that you evaluate them is by whether or not that paper is like there or not. So if like the paper is there and all that, like, yeah, the judgment that the paper does not exist, it, you know, doesn't make it not existing and all that. So like, you know, it's yeah, that's something that wasn't pointed out about like, at least as I think this is much more could be not just in a critique of Hegel whether or not he's represented him correctly, but in general like some idealist trends, at least some of the ones that are like in regards to absolute idealists. Yeah. But yep, yeah, we can. But we can now move to like the denial of positivism, and yeah,
Sure.
this is the one that like I think most people have like at least found like engaged with in different ways, and not just in epistemology, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, logical positivism is like basically all the science popularizers and uh, such. They usually are coming at it from like a logical positivist point of view, and the same with like atheists. A lot of atheists are following logical positivism, especially like whenever you see atheists say something like, "Oh, well, if it's not verifiable, doesn't then we can't know that whether it exists or not, or it has to be tested with science alone." Scientism is kind of just it's kind of maybe it could be described as like a more extreme version of logical positivism. um, but I mean they come from the same kind of point of view, even though I mean if you ask your standard new atheist what logical posit, they probably wouldn't know what it is. But that's kind of the tradition that they're kind of coming from.
Yeah. Um, yeah, the way that Wilson describes it is the principle of verification goes as that there is no such thing as things in the realist sense, but only facts. And what happens here is that your your senses grasp these facts, and then your mind like orders those facts just for mere pragmatism. And this is so the principle of verification is based on this understanding of how we come to know things, and how what things are, which is that they're not really just things, they're just kind of like there. And if your senses identifies them, then there's something you can say that it is true or not true, because even like a logical positivist would not use the terms like true or real or something like that when trying to make a judgment about the facts that is grasping. But it kind of just says that like it's the judgment that you make about it can be either meaningful or non-meaningful or non-meaningful. Yeah, so if you can identify with one of the senses a particular judgment, um, then that's a meaningful statement. But if you cannot identify it with any of the senses, then it's not a meaningful statement. So like they would say that. Let me see if this one works. Like is this cup is hot or warm and all that. You can identify with some of the senses there, and they will say that that's a meaningful statement. But when it comes to like saying that being is being, they cannot identify with any of the senses. So therefore, like being is being, the judgment is not. It's not that it's not true or false. It's just it's gibberish. It's a meaningless statement. That's what the logical positive is doing there.
Correct. Um, uh, Also, for those who are listening, I just wanted to mention that this book, "Man's Knowledge of Reality," is actually available on Google Books for free. So if you want to follow along as we read through this, you can do that there. But yeah, he that's I mean basically that's all that there is to verificationism. It's just like this idea that if it's not verifiable, then it's not meaningful. And Wilhelmsen then goes on to point out that, well, the problem with verificationism is that it's not verifiable. You can't verify the claim that whatever is verifiable or whatever is meaningful must be verifiable. Meaningful in itself is not like something that's verifiable. It's not something that's in the sense experiences. You don't sense meaning. It's an abstraction uh, from kind of like what we experience. It's more of an well, we we'll get more into what meaning is later on in this book, but it's the key is that it's not part of a sense experience, and neither is the statement that everything that's meaningful must be verifiable. Um, I think he even says that sense experience itself, like the abstract concept, isn't a sense experience. And so, like, the entire system is just self defeating, is basically the conclusion.
Yeah, and when you look at the history of logical positivists and logical positivists, most of them basically gave up on self-described logical positivists, like basically denounce that the principle of verification. My bad. It's within their own lifetimes. This is something that you will rarely see happen in the field of philosophy. Then most of it's the advocates of like this particular method or this particular system of philosophy and all that like ended up in their own lifetimes like denouncing it like that after in the at the same time where they came up with it. That was it. I always find this to be interesting. I know that Frederick Copleston does have like a book on the logical positivists and interestingly with the existentialists and sort of like how like like these things how it came from like the Cambridge and some of the sort of like Anglo philosophers of the time, sort of like having this sort of common trend of like an existential experience or so and all that. But anyway, yeah, that's yeah, logical positivism, the principle of verification, pretty much, it's easily refutable in that you can turn that principle of verification on its same sort of claim. And yeah, so there's nothing really to like put too much thought into it. There's very interestingly, I think that there is at least just one person that calls themselves a logical positivist around in these circles and all that. But anyway, yeah, it's not really a very serious contender in regards to like these in regards to these things and what we're talking about epistemology and all. And from here on, we just move out to what you were speaking about, which is that it is impossible really to deny the principle of being because you end up using the principle of being in order to deny being, and which is an absurd thing to do. You're denying like existence by the principle of existence. Say that existence is not being, or not that being is non-being, and all that. And it's like, yeah, it's an absurd sort of proposition to make. Yeah.
John, did you have something you wanted to add?
Oh, I haven't read William's book, but the moment you dropped his name, I'm like, okay, I'll Google that, and got in Google Books before you even mentioned that. Yeah, no, the Hegel is one of the best writers in all of philosophy. Just for clarity, on the positives point, I do think that there's an important thing to note though, which is although positivism as such, right, has fallen out of favor among analytic philosophers, it still has this kind of ghostly influence where you can see people who aren't strict positivists, but still ultimately end up just being unable to fully move beyond positivism as such. This would be the case, for example, in the mid 20th century with the so-called logical empiricists. So you had right the failure of positivism, right, which posits right that all we can know and all that is meaningful are just descriptive statements of empirically observable conditions, right, verification, right, and then due to problems with verification, you then have Popper's theory of falsification, right, that something is meaningful only if it is in theory possible to falsify it rather than to verify it, because there are certain things that you might just not be able to really verify directly, although maybe in theory you might you might be able to if you can't. And so then the theory of meaning theory ends up being switched to a falsificationist model where something's meaningful if and only if it makes predictions that could be disproven, right? And on that basis, Popper, actually, I think quite rightly, dismisses Freudianism and Marxism as pseudoscientific, since Freudianism and Marxism, their theories comport completely with all possible outcomes, right? If there's a uprising of the workers, it's because the proletariat, right? The dialectic of history has arisen, and the proletariat has arisen and overthrown the capitalist overlords. But if they fail to do so, well, it's merely because they have a false consciousness, and so therefore you can't make any firm predictions because no matter what happens, it's going to be completely explained by the theory. So there's no empirical for that. But the one thing that I just wanted to add as far as what I would call kind of zombie positivism in a way, which you alluded to with science popularizers, and I think that's where you find it the most explicitly. But even just among any analytic philosophers who want to try to reduce any form of talk and the identification of causality to just merely some form of logical conditions. So saying something is a cause if it's a necessary. Ultimately, all you're doing there is you're just giving descriptions of relations, and you're not actually grasping anything such as path or essences as grounding these. And so really, if we want to get to the heart of positivism, it's just claiming that all we can know are descriptions of how things appear, and we can have rigorous organization of those descriptions into some sort of logical hierarchy, but there is no way to actually know the fundamental principles of why things occur. You just can have more and more universal theories of how things occur, but you'll never actually get down to a notion of why, which is why for them you're going to have atheism, because there's no notion of a cause with a power that would require there to be a metaphysical being that would account for or be necessary to account for the existence of, say, motion or just being itself in terms of material reality.
Interesting. Thanks for adding that. So I think we covered. One thing I was gonna say, I think as far as Popper goes, I'm pretty sure I agree. He's he had this principle of falsificationism as a sort of alternative to logical positivism, I guess you could say. But my understanding is that he wouldn't say that this is like the only way of knowing things. It's just like a theory. It just goes as far as science goes. It's just like a theory of like what makes something part of like a scientific theory. Whereas he wouldn't. My understanding is that he wouldn't necessarily deny that you can have metaphysics that's like not falsifiable, since that's outside of science.
Yeah, but then on the other hand, right? I mean, he definitely applies it within the realm of science. I guess then we would just have to go one step further and say, okay, great. So your standard for something to be a scientific theory, right? Falsifiable. What's your criterion for a true statement, right? And I don't know what these guys go to. I haven't read enough Popper on that particular point, but it seems to me that falsification falsification would be something where I think they would want to say, well, unless you give a explanation of why, like God is responsible for the world, unless that can be falsified in some way, then that's not really explanatory, and thus you would eliminate the ability to argue for the existence of God.
Yeah, I've definitely heard people say that. Um, I don't know if that was Popper's view exactly, but in any case,
I think it follows. Anyway, no need to give these guys more time than they're worth.
yeah, I mean, I don't think that falsificationism works in general anyway. Like, I mean, as a theory, I mean, I think I mean, that's just not how science. Um, but anyway, uh, I think we can probably get into chapter 6 now, John. Sorry, John. There's two Johns now.
We can get into chapter 6. This chapter is one that I kind of been going back and forward more than the other chapters, because this is something I haven't really considered before, which is the sort of the way that we express, our understanding. Like we express being in common language, and and Wilson gets into some things to consider. Like it's not just like like he's just adding like like this cool fact about like that language and being and this and all that, but like it's you know but how does like being participate in the way that we express express things in general and all that. And so like I said, it's I'm still like going even back and forward um on this part, on this one chapter. But yeah, I think that there's some things that have been said, sort of implied before in the previous chapters about, um, in regards to that you can't, like being an existence, like escapes the conceptual order. This is something that you'll see, especially when it comes to like a language, and the way that we express things too. Because in order to like even like speak of things, as we already said, by the principle of like indubitability, it's like you can't really deny being. You're going to be using like the using the principle of being, even when you didn't like thought of it in the first place and all that, because you're just there, and you're just kind of like when you're expressing things, you're signifying things that are there too. You know.
Well, one thing about the way that we use principles, like the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of excluded middle, and all that, is for the most part we don't actually use them in thought. Um, uh, that is to say, if you're reasoning, the principle of non-contradiction, unless you're doing, say, a reduction to absurdity proof, isn't going to be a premise. It's rather just presupposed as the condition for you being able to make assertions, period, right? And so that's really where it kind of comes in. It's the fundamental background, which is must be presupposed to engage in reasoning at all. So even those who don't, who would attempt to deny it, right, as you guys were saying earlier, the moment they make it, they have a thought, they are forced to recognize its truth because they didn't not have it at the same time. So that's, we're not really using them. It's more they're just describing the fundamental reality of what we're doing.
Well, let me just talk a little bit about like what's in this chapter. So, um, he says that, well, I think he says language is like an interior and exterior expression, um, and that when we're talking about symbols, he says that symbols are a material thing, material slash physical thing, and B, it is made by man to represent an act of knowledge. And actually, this is something that I was thinking was kind of interesting because he pointed out that things can be symbols. So, for example, smoke can be a symbol of fire, for example, or maybe not a symbol, but a sign. Smoke is a sign of fire. It shows or sort of represents to us the fire, but it's not a symbol. Um, it's not something that has meaning in the same way that human beings, like human language, has meaning. And so I thought that was an interesting distinction in the fact that um, uh, he says that a symbol doesn't just mean something, must be understood formally as meaning something. and it's only really meaningful when it produces a union of the intention of another with the person who's understanding it. Um, so it's kind of it has to be intentional. I guess that's the additional thing, that it has to intend to communicate some form of knowledge to another person. It can't just symbolize something. It can't just signify something. It has to be intended by another person to share this knowledge with another and create that sort of union uh, of our knowledge that we have with another person. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, this is something really what I was describing to a friend of mine in regards to language and animals is like like he says that animals have like a way of communication that can be said to be a sort of a language, a very primitive sort. Um, I kind of responded by saying like I don't think you can declare that as like being a language because what they're communicating is sound and they're reacting to a particular sound. That's mostly what you see there. For something to be a language, it has to be something to be understood. Like there has to be that of like the person understanding, and like the nature of things, and the things that he's expressing. So that's where kind of like language is a very peculiar thing, a very human thing, and all that. It's at least part of human nature, not of the nature of like of other things. Even they have sentience. You can't say that that particular animal is understanding not understanding the nature of other things or even its own. To say they're just you can maybe say that they're just reacting on those things, and also like a parrot, for example, repeating the same words. They're mostly just mimicking the sound, not necessarily like comprehending the word that they're repeating. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
no,
yeah, communicate. Yeah.
he yeah, I think he talks about that animals can create sounds and such that can signify uh, you know their internal kind of states, like um, although it signifies things about them, it's more like the smoke from the fire. It's not actual language. Animal doesn't have the ability to kind of have, well, it doesn't have knowledge, um, and it doesn't have this ability to intend to communicate knowledge to another person. So yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point, because a lot of people will talk about, especially today, will talk about how animals have some sort of primitive language, like you were saying. Um, Go
Yeah,
ahead,
no,
John.
it's no, yeah, no, it's interesting. I just got done with a lecture yesterday where we went over this point with animals and language, right? And it seems to me that the error that you guys are talking about, right, is actually not the reduction of what language is, the ascription of language to animals when they don't actually fulfill the required for what they do to be language. So an ape, right, who's taught American Sign Language, right, and makes certain signs and whatnot, because have meaning to us, because we know the meaning, we know what those signs represent, right? When the animal forms them, we assume, right? We assume that the animal is using them to represent the meaning that we understand them to represent. And so then we say, oh, well, they're doing the representative action, therefore they must have language, right? And the key difference, I think, and this is part of what the rest of the chapter gets at, which I'm just screening through right now, gets to, is that a key part of actually determining whether you're using language in a truly linguistic way, or whether it's just mimicry, or kind of an animal doing a trick, right? The animal's trained to use a certain word in a certain context, and then performs that word because it will be rewarded if it performs the word or something, right? Is their grammar, are the words put together in a structure, right, that shows there's an understanding of the ideas that are represented by the words, such that you are ordering them which represents a more complex thought, and you actually understand the interrelation of the ideas. And so that really is kind of the kind of test as to whether words are being used linguistically to convey and to represent and signify um, actual an actual understanding of reality, or whether it's just being used right in this merely facile, superficial way.
Right. Um, and so the next part that I found interesting, he talks about other things too, like nouns and verbs, and the fact that verbs signify actions, and I mean, I'm sure there's some philosophical significance to that. I didn't really. I mean, it seems kind of basic to me, um, but it gets interesting whenever he starts talking about, well, is it a noun, or is it a verb, or is it a participle? Um, and he argues that being does not signify a noun. And he uses an argument that I've heard from Norris Clark before in his book on the one and the many, or at least a variation that's similar to that, where he points out, well, okay, so nouns, and I guess this is why he sets up what nouns and verbs are, is that nouns like signify an essence. It points to an essence or nature. And if being were just like simply another way of saying what a thing is or its essence, then it would follow that, let's say, hat, which is the example he gives, and being would be interchangeable terms. To say that a hat, to say hat and say being a hat, those would be the same thing. And if um, if that were the case, then it would be impossible for anything else to be being, because if if what it means to be is to be a hat, then that would mean that you couldn't be, or a shoe couldn't be, it couldn't have existence, because hat and shoes are or, well, they're not contraries, but they're not the same thing, right? So it's just like, if it's based on the principle of transitivity, from what I understand. If hat equals being, and shoe equals being, then shoe would equal a hat, um, which is absurd. So he presents that as a reason for why um, being cannot just signify the essence of a thing. He also talks about, let's see.
Oh, I was gonna mention
Do you
that,
have
like, when it
anything?
comes to nouns, what nouns signified is like states of being or essences. But he also adds that they represented in a static order. That, like, when you're talking, when you're using a noun, what you're kind of like is doing, represented it within a, like, signifying it within a static order and all that. Like, uh, and then you have, he points out to words like immobile or flight, or immobile flight, something like that. Is like, it's as to sort of like explain what he means by that, but he goes into focus on flight, which is like, it's it's not necessarily static on its own, because it comes from flying, but like, but it is represented in a static way. But it's just because it's represented in a static way doesn't mean that it is static in itself. Yeah, and that's kind of one of the things that plays into understanding why being is not. You cannot represent being as something static and all that. And this also goes into that explanation that we talked about earlier, which is that being in existence escapes conceptualization and all that. And one of the things that you're doing when it comes to, you know, coming up with a noun, is that you're in a sense sort of like conceptualizing it. So being in existence, they would escape. They would, because existence and being as prior to conceptualization. Yeah.
Interesting. So that was the first reason. The second reason he gives is he says that, well, if being signifies as a noun, then it means essence or nature. And it would follow that given given that something is what it is, that it would necessarily exist. So, for example, if he uses Kant's example, uh, where if you have $1,000 real dollars, and 1,000 imaginary dollars, well, if there, I guess, if there's not a um, distinction between uh, the meaning of the term $1,000 and its existence, then merely from the fact that you understand what $1,000 is, or that they're I don't know if I'm putting this right, but basically that the meaning of $1,000 would also mean that it exists. Basically,
I mean, in this chapter is basically building up to the two doctrines that one, being is not a category but a transcendental, number one, and then two, the real distinction between essence and existence, which is what that second point. So the first thing with hat, right? The hat example is really showing being is not a category; it is transcategorical. And the second one with being and the $1,000 is showing the difference between essence and existence. So what it is to be $100 is different from what it is for $100 to actually exist, right? 100 imaginary dollars is just as many dollars in terms of being dollars, has the same monetary value as 100. You can't spend it because it's not a being, right? At the real distinction, even though Kant denied that being is a predicate, as a particle that being could be a predicate, or that is would be a predicate, signifying an act of the thing. But nonetheless, the point stands for just establishing that idea.
yeah, I think some people might dispute with you though a little bit that because I've heard people say that, oh well, this doesn't, these kind of thought examples, it doesn't show that it's a real distinction. It could just be a distinction of reason.
Yeah, no, definitely, and I think all that Kant's example shows is a distinction of reason. A grammatical distinction only shows a logical difference, but then we require a causal,
Right.
a kind of causal argument, like Aquinas gives, to get to the real distinction. But anyway, guys, I gotta go. But if you're gonna be doing more of this spaces on this book, I'd love to hop on whenever it's going down.
Okay, yeah, I'll send you a link to the next one. We're going to be probably doing the next two chapters next.
All right, sounds good. All right, have a good one.
But yeah, like he was saying, he's trying to show, yeah, that there's a difference between, well, signifying. The reason why I want to say signifying and not just like a distinction between essence and existence is because of that logical versus real distinction. Because it could just be all basically in our mind that there's a distinction between essence and existence, um, just based on these arguments alone. Um, but that's all that he's trying to show here. He's trying to show that whenever we use term being, all that it signifies, what it signifies is different from um, the nature or essence of a thing. And that's shown in this second reason by the fact that you can signify uh, that $100, what $100 is, without signifying its existence. And so there's a distinction here between what you're signifying, the existence of the $100 and what it is. And so that shows that being is not signified as a noun because a noun signifies the essence of a thing. So that's to signify something distinct, which is, of course, its existence.
Yeah, and from here on, this is where we move on into where in the way that we express thing is like what where being sort of participates in the expression, and he gets into verb and the participle and all that. So like he talks that the verb is an act, an action of some sorts, and flying, moving, changing, operating, and all that. These are like actions, and these are usually you will find them in the verb. They signify a verb. But the thing is that the verb you can't have like a pure action. Like there's no such thing as like an abstract sort of moving, changing, or operating, flying. Like these things don't exist on themselves, in themselves, but rather they exist in participation with something. And this is kind of where like we come either with a noun or something in general that this verb is participating with and all that. This is the participle, and so the verb is contained within contained within the participle here. And so Wilhelmsen goes on to talk about like being as it signifies as a verb and as a participle. It's yeah, that's how he starts off like that. Yeah.
Sure. And I thought it was interesting because, like, a lot of people will talk about the participle in like grammatical terms, right? Which is perfectly fine, of course. But he talks about it, kind of linking it back to like the Platonist idea of participation, in that it's kind of taking it apart in some. Yeah, he says the thing takes a part in some act, um, where there's sort of like this universal idea of uh, running, let's say, and the runner or the person who's running participates in that universal act of running, and that makes it um, particular. He's not necessarily saying anything. I mean, I'm sure he has this metaphysical idea in his head, but he's not necessarily saying anything about metaphysics here, I don't think. But um, with that's how the language works, at least. Um, and yeah, so his conclusion here is that being is a verb as participated by uh, some being, something that is described in terms of a noun. Um, and I can't remember if he talks about this specifically. I think he does, but I might be thinking about a different section of the book where he points out, well, okay, this is so important because um, when we're talking about acts, they're not since they're not nouns, they're not really things. They're not things. They're not things that we know. They're totally different. And so, like, whenever we're talking about knowing things, it's not going to be this thing. It's going to be an act, and it's not going to be something that we can imagine, like like a thing, which leads to a lot of problems in the way that people think about knowledge and also being itself. Because if they think about knowledge and being as a thing, uh, and they're imagining it, they're going to come up with all these false ideas about it. Thinking about it as an act, which is, we can know conceptually what that is, um, but we can't uh, imagine it. It's like a totally different thing. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
No, that perfectly puts forward what's happening here, which is that yeah, as already been stated repeatedly, is like being escapes conceptualization. So it's like that's and a lot of the like problems with contemporary modern philosophy is that it's they have this like attempt to like try to conceptualize being, and the moment that they do it, that's where they miss the plot, and most likely they will end in a more like an idealist uh, sort of trend of understanding things. So it's so you can't really treat being as a thing or as a concept at all. You're just kind of making something up at this point, you know. And so when you think of being as an act, an act of existing, as a doing, that's that is what's being there. Like the verb to be, like being that's where being it be taken from. um,
True, and I mean, one way to think about this is that, like, okay, it's not like a physical thing that you're adding on to another physical thing. It's not like you have $100 real and then you add on this physical thing that's existence. I think that's probably the mistake. It's more of it's an action. So it's like something that $100 do. Does that sound right?
yeah, I think it does. Because yeah, like, you can't really reduce being to something like that, like something static as a noun at all. So it's like it is an act of existing. It is an act of existing is something that is not static. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people, uh, it, given our modern way of thinking about things, especially given like Hume's idea that, well, if it's imaginable, then it's possible, and those kind of ideas. The fact that being isn't really imaginable, and you can't think about it in this kind of materialistic idea of like adding it on to things. It's going to be really difficult for people to understand. And I think you just have to reflect on actions like running and different kinds of actions and conceptualize how they're actually different from like physical things that you're adding to things, and then
Yeah.
you can grasp what existence is, or well, to a
I
degree.
mean, Aristotle this with change. It can be something as just as that, as contemplating like change, and from there on, getting into more of like how existence operates in general. Yeah.
Okay. Well, do you have anything else you want to talk about? I think that's the end of this week's thing.
Yeah, that's pretty much yeah, what we can cover at least on this chapter. There's a lot I think that it can, like touch, but I don't think it's going to be related to the subject of epistemology though.
Uh huh.
So yeah, no, that I definitely found this chapter at least very useful into something that I haven't like really considered properly before. So it's like the way that kind of we come to express being, and sort of like understanding the mechanisms of language and meaning as how it is that we can come up with an expression of it. And the next chapter is going to be sort of related to that, which is the logic of existence, not necessarily focusing on language and meaning, but it's more just um, like going back on that like understanding existence, and like what happens when you kind of like try to conceptualize it, and from there and then alongside other things there too. Yeah.